We have completed 25 years of our existence. The journal is now 25 years old. And in these 25 years, we have never missed any deadline. And we have been punctual. We have been, and of course, we have never compromised on our values. So it has been a very satisfactory year for us. And the second reason is that today we have Professor Irfan Habib giving the 14th MSJ lecture. Medieval History Journal, as you would know, is an international journal in the sense that each issue of Medieval History Journal carries contributions from around the world on various themes, various kinds of issues and regions. MSJ is not a region-specific journal specific to Europe or India or China or anywhere. It has contributions from around the world on themes which are very, very varied themes. So Medieval History Journal, the medieval and the history part of it are very expansive rather than restrictive. Medieval merely extends into early modern as well. And therefore, it's a great satisfaction to us that we have been around for 25 years, and we welcome you all to contribute your articles to the MSJ. The second reason, as I said, is that Professor Irfan Habib will be giving the lecture today. This is the 14th lecture. The Medieval History Journal started the lecture series in the 11th year of its existence, after it had survived for 10 years. And we have since then every year held lectures by the world's most frontline historians. Professor Habib is one of those frontline historians from India who has actually, along with a few others, redefined Indian history in a way in the first decade, after the first decade of India's independence. He has the history that we had received, the history writing that we had received from colonial historians had one single entry point, namely religious identity of the ruling class or ruling dynasty, and therefore religion as the sort of an analytical category for Indian history. Professor Habib and a few others, they substituted class for religion as the entry point into history, and therefore it was a sea change. The whole landscape of history writing changed after that. Once the wall of the door of religious identity as the entry point was broken, history expanded into many disparate themes, regions of India, perspectives, databases, and today it's a different world altogether. In the last 50 or 60 years, it has really been revolutionized completely. We are fortunate that Professor Irfan Habib is one of them who really brought about this transformation, and he is therefore, we are very happy therefore that he agreed to speak to us. Professor Irfan Habib has already entered into his 91st year, and therefore it's a remarkable testimony to both his energy and his commitment that he still gives lectures, participates in discussions, usually online, and still does research, new research for his lectures and discussions and so on and so forth. So it's a great testimony to, great compliment to Professor Irfan Habib that he is still serving the discipline that he had started as almost as a student, undergraduate student, perhaps 60 or 70 years ago. So welcome, Professor Habib, and you have decided to speak on a theme which has interested you for a long time, the theme of reason versus religion in medieval India. Reason and religion, they have been counterposed, often counterposed, sometimes not even counterposed. But in all of history, not only of India, but around the world, and therefore there has been a kind of constant tension between reason on one hand and religion, which is often equated also with superstition and so on. So that Professor Habib has decided to take on this theme of reason versus religion, standing up naturally very, very strongly in favor of reason, that he has espoused almost since he was a student, as I said. It's a great occasion for us, Professor Habib. You have a very vast audience waiting for you to hear. They are just joining in one by one. I'm sure the audience would be very happy if I stopped talking and invited you to address them. Professor Habib, it's all yours.
Professor Mukhya, members of the editorial committee of Medieval History Journal, and friends who have decided to listen in to this lecture. I'm most gratified at having this opportunity of speaking on a particular aspect of medieval ideology as represented in Persian literature, namely the conflict between reason and religion. I should first confess that both these words are open to various interpretations. Even religion, I see that dictionary meanings, the English dictionaries in particular, define religion by having the concept of what Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are like, religions with prophets. These definitions did not apply to many other religions. For instance, where the belief in God is a very secondary aspect. And there are morality, for instance, is more emphasized than faith, and so forth. So largely, I would take religion in the sense of beliefs and prejudices that are carried in some texts that are regarded as sacred. Reason is as hard to define. And I was just looking at the big OED, and there are so many definitions of reason that I was thinking whether I'm using the correct word when I'm saying reason versus religion. By and large, I would say that reason is based on basically the findings of observation and science. Direct observation, not superstition and belief, and the results of scientific effort. So the more science develops, the more the concept of reason is refined. Reason also involves logic, but of course, logic is present in religion also. If you have a certain beliefs, then by logic you can develop, you can draw inferences. So logic is something which applies to both reason and religion, but has greater place in reason than it has in religion, which has a large number of axioms which are just given. Now, we often hear that India has been a religious country. Beliefs have been very strong here, whether you take beliefs in incarnation or migration, transmigration of souls, or taking Islam in God and Prophet and what message has been laid out through the Quran and the Hadith, that is to say, through the main text attributed to God and the sayings attributed to the Prophet. Here, since I'm basically proceeding on Persian evidence, it is the conflict between reason and Islam that will have primacy in my address. Of course, the same conflict would be present in non-Islamic ideologies in India, but I am basically concerned on what how the conflict proceeded within the language of Persian, or within Persian literature. What was asserted there on one side and what was defied on the other, and so on. But basically, I'm proceeding on the Arabic-Persian evidence, mainly Persian, but of course, Arabic was more important in the beginning. Now, it does happen that there are two terms which correspond to the English words reason and religion in Arabic and Persian. Reason is represented by aql, that is to say, what people think from their intellect based on observation, direct observation, based on scientific observation. Whether religion is represented by naql, that is to say, you follow the prescribed word. For instance, a Muslim would follow the Quran, represented as the God's word, and Hadith, what is attributed to the Prophet, and the theology, the Sharia, built on this evidence. So that's regarded as manqul, or as opposed to aql, where you apply your own intellect, and in manqul, what you have inherited, what is there in the holy texts that you regard as scriptures. And the conflict between these two, aql and naql, or maqulat and manqulat, was already recognized by the historian Zia Barni, the famous historian, who, writing in 1350s, censured Sultan Muhammad Tughlaq, who died in 1351 after a reign of some 27 years, for his belief in maqulat, or rational sciences, against the traditional truths, or manqulat. He attributed this fault to the Sultan keeping company with Saad the logician, Ubaid the poet, Najm Intishar the philosopher, and Alimuddin also a philosopher. That is to say, he attributed his beliefs in reason to secular sources. Let me first not even use the scientific sources, but secular forces, non-religious sources. Logician, poet, thinker, and so on. And he saw it as a conflict in which he himself demanded that those who believe in maqulat or reason should be put to death. Therefore, in another work, he actually praised Mahmud of Ghazni for his supposed desire to kill with torture Bu Ali Sina, known to Europe as Avicenna, the last great rational philosopher and practically the major authority in Unani medicine, in Islamic, Arab, Persian medicine. Thus, in the 14th century, when Burney was writing, the conflict between these two traditions was well established. And here, therefore, I would like to go back first to an earlier period and trace briefly how this conflict began to arise in what might be loosely called Islamic thought, or if you like, Arab Persian literature. First of all, there was the influence of Greek rational sciences. When the Arabs in the 7th century conquered Syria and Egypt, they found the main official language and literary language there to be Greek. And Syriac, the language spoken in the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate, the 7th century, was Syriac based really on Greek. And therefore, in 8th century onwards, the Arabs became heirs to the Greek philosophical and scientific heritage. And a wonderfully very large number of Greek texts, philosophical as well as scientific, were translated into Arabic. Often this is regarded in history as one of the great translation projects. Many of the translations have now disappeared, but many survive, or references to them survive. And they became the basic texts for both scientists and philosophers, first writing in Arabic and then in Persian. Among these was Al-Biruni, whose book on India, Kitabul Hind, written in Arabic by 1035, was called by a famous historian of India a moment in history. His description of Indian sciences and social practices in India would look very modern to a reader if he didn't know that he's reading Zakhao's translation of an Arabic text of the 11th century. This is very modern because of its totally rational outlook throughout. And it's very objective attitude towards Indian sciences and Indian beliefs. He does not write as an opponent of Hinduism, for example, but as a student of it. And in this book alone, he quotes 17 Greek authors, 17 Greek authors. In fact, he also quotes New Testament and Bible and is greatly appreciative of the New Testament. So this is the kind of heritage, ideological inheritance that was brought to India by scholars of Arabic and Persian, along with, of course, the religious scriptures and what is called manqulat or deen. But this particular heritage of Akla reason that was brought to India should also be particularly remembered. Now, the Greek knowledge of Greek through Arabic continued for a long time. In the Mughal period also, as late as 1616, Thomas Rowe, the English envoy, noted that you needn't argue about Aristotle or Euclid, along with Averroes, Raji, with the mullahs here. They know all about it. And Abul Fazl, the minister of Akbar, was particularly proud that his son had a Greek temperament, Mushrib-e Yunani, so that the association of Greek learning with reason was there, and the importance attributed to writings of philosophical writings of Aristotle and the mathematical and contributions of Euclid and also Ptolemy were well known to Persian writers. In fact, if you look at the geographical section of the Ain-e-Akbari that Abul Fazl wrote, the entire geographical section about the world, about latitudes and longitudes, is based on Ptolemy, Ptolemaic concept of world geography. So one must always remember that the Greek heritage remained until the end of the Mughal period a very living part of thought in both Arabic and Persian in India, as in also in other Islamic countries. It must, however, be remembered that when we talk of reason based on sciences, the concept of sciences at that time was not exactly ours. For instance, astrology and alchemy were also considered sciences. Al-Biruni at one place writes in his Kitabul Hind that it would be a wrong policy for astronomers to condemn astrology because astronomy is supported by rulers and the rich only because it is the basis of astrology. If the belief gains ground that astrology is useless, then astronomy would not be supported by the princes and the rich. This is a very common sense observation because indeed astronomical observations and astronomical observatories were established in countries where Arabic and Persian were the main languages, mainly because astral observation of stars and heavenly bodies was considered essential for astrology, for working out future or indeed present dangerous moments or present moments which were regarded as propitious. So all this was attributed to astrology, and therefore a practically superstitious belief, which we now know, of course, had no basis in fact, supported research in a very important branch of science, and that was astronomy. Well, of course, that had its limitations. Al-Biruni was not, for instance, interested, though he reported it, in Aryabhat's epochal observation that it is the earth that moves and the heaven that rests. Astronomers alike in Europe and the Islamic world, and most Indian astronomers also, believed rather that the universe moves and the earth rests, which of course was only overthrown when Copernicus presented his entire view of the solar system. But Copernicus himself believed in astrology. Therefore, though astronomers were wrong, as we now know, the universe doesn't move around here. But still, they believed that the stars move of themselves and not are used or pushed by angels. And that, of course, was quite an important belief that religious people didn't hold. They thought that angels are moving the stars. And I will come to that presently. Now, on the side of the world, outside reason and science, strictly, outside medicine, outside astronomy, which were the basic sciences at that time, which were free of superstition, which were free of, no tabib or physician would say that any prayer would cure you. They knew only medicines and helped. And similarly, astronomers believed only on what they saw and believed that stars moved of themselves, not by angels. But this was not the common belief. And among Sufis, for example, Nizamuddin Aulia in his Conversations, reported by Amir Hassan Sidzi early in the 14th century, said that the stars are moved by angels. And twice he quoted a story where a theologian goes to the caliph at the time, pushes out the astronomer, and shows to the caliph how an angel is pushing the whole universe, encircling the earth, giving us day and night. So clearly the Sufis were one with the ulama or mullahs in denouncing science. Nevertheless, the Sufis, by trying to present a morality distinct from Sharia, not necessarily opposed to Sharia, but distinct from Sharia, also opened, in some respects, the path to science, to reason. For instance, I'll give you one example. According to the Sharia, a Muslim cannot be converted into non-Muslim. This is a great sin if you help. But to Nizamuddin, it was reported by Hassan Sidzi that when as an officer he was in Deogir, he bought a girl, slave, Hindu slave, which had been enslaved, in order to return it to her parents, father and mother, who had come crying because she had been seized by a soldier and so on. This meant, of course, that a girl who had been converted to Islam was now going back to Hinduism. When Amir Hassan was worried because according to Shariat he had committed a great sin, the girl would now go to hell, not to heaven. When he told his quandary to Nizamuddin Aulia after he had returned, Nizamuddin said, first he wept at the story and said, "You had done well," and told another story of his Sufi who had similarly received his enslaved woman so that she could join her children, knowing that she would now transfer from Islam to Hinduism. Therefore, it is also true that Sufis did, in fact, modify the Sharia, sometimes at calls of humanity, as we have just seen in these two stories. And when you come to certain Sufis, like Rabia Basri of Basra, who lived around 700 AD, then she was a figure who particularly challenged the Sharia. And Nasiruddin, the disciple of Nizamuddin Aulia, in his Malfuzat, in his conversations, gives a curious story without being asked. And the whole point of the story was that Rabia Basri showed to men theologians and Mr. Sufis that the whole story of women receiving only 1/10 of wisdom while receiving 9/10 of lust at the point of creation was absurd. By challenging them and saying that I, a woman, am able to face 9/10 of lust by only 1/10 of wisdom, whereas you men folk with 9/10 of wisdom are not able to face 1/10 of lust. Now, this challenged, of course, one of the favorite stories about creation current among Muslims and regarded them as true, regarded by all Muslim theologians as the very truth. So, Sufis also indirectly undermined theology and therefore religion. This is particularly to be seen in Persian poetry, to which I shall come, and also to the influence of Persian poetry. My father didn't write it, but he was fond of saying that poetry saved Muslims. And I asked him why, and he said that they could say in poetry what they could never say in prose. And that, I think, is a very important feature of Persian poetry, which we shouldn't forget. In Persian poetry, there is a particular hostile attitude towards religion, towards established religion. How it developed, I'm not going into details. It may be the Iranian answer to the Arab, which Firdausi Shahnama represented, that a barbarous race should come to rule over us. Or it had other developments, sources. But by the time of Amir Khusro, this was very well established. The world of love was opposed to the world of religion in Persian poetry. And I will cite one verse which had been, actually it's a huge joke, so badly represented. Amir Khusro in one verse says that every race and country, every qawm has its own religion. Its religion and its direction of prayer. But I reject everything. My prayer direction is in that of my beloved woman, the woman I love. Kachkula. Kachkula was the word then used for woman, particularly a Turkish woman, because the Turkish women used to wear their cap or. Now, by Jahangir's time, this had been forgotten that Kachkula meant a woman. And therefore, the story reported in the Turku developed that Kachkula there was represented by poor Nizamuddin Aulia, who would have been shocked if anyone would have called him Kachkula because that meant a woman. Amir Khusro is saying that all religions are on one side, but my religion is love of a woman. And then in India, Persian poetry, also, you will see that the beloved woman is called a but. Why? Because the idol is worshipped. And it is Butkhana one goes to. If you turn to Persian poetry, on the other hand, Persian poetry in Iran, say Hafiz, the same distinction is there. But instead of Butkhana, Hafiz goes to a Maikhana, to the wine shop. His priest, his peer, leads him to the Maikhana, to the wine. And he invokes the Sufic belief in the peer, say that I will be guided by my peer. My peer says, wash the prayer cloth with wine. A Muslim washing the prayer carpet with wine. This is what Hafiz finds. And he invokes the Sufic belief in peer. He says, my peer says that. I must obey. Therefore, the use of a Sufic institution in order to promote an opposition to Orthodox religion. And then all those verses where he attacks Orthodox religion, they sermonize, but when they go into and the mosque, they sermonize, but when they go into privacy, they do the very things they denounce outside. That is his famous verse. Therefore, Hafiz Shirazi, writing in 15th century, it also represents what one might call the secular side, if not the total rational side of ideology. But that certainly promotes anti-theological perceptions in among those who read Persian poetry. And Hafiz, of course, is a major figure of Persian poetry. Now, when you come to India again, back to India, remember that Persian by the 14th century was the major language of government. And by the Mughal period, it was practically the language, written language, official language, common to both Hindus and Muslims who worked in government or government offices, down almost to the village officials. Now, therefore, the influence of Persian literature, whether Hafiz or whether Amir Khusro, should not be underrated. This was the inheritance of 15th and 16th century India. And I will now come to the period of Akbar, in which I think the whole movement in rational movement, what I would call the rational movement, the movement of reason, probably reached its apex. If you take the development of Akbar's religious policy, which we must go into if we want to understand why the trend towards reason in the latter half of Akbar's reign, then you will see that from the beginning, Akbar's policy of religion's tolerance did not involve a questioning of Islam as a religion or even a question of Islamic orthodoxy. It was more a practice of convenience, intermarry with Rajput houses, abolish the jizya, begin grants to temple priests in temples from 1565 onwards, very early in his reign. Jizya abolition came in 1563. Don't enslave populations, rural populations. He prohibited slavery, he prohibited slave trade. Popularly believed to be at the instance of a Brahman mistress. But in the 1560s, a very important measure, it is forgotten that Mughal Empire did not permit slave markets, unlike Delhi Sultanate. There was no slave market, and slave trade was also prohibited by Akbar. But at the same time, he was quite orthodox. Went to the Ajmer shrine repeatedly almost every year. Had his 5 prayers daily, and so on. In that, as my colleague Professor Habib pointed out, in his Fateh-Nama-e Chittor, on the declaration issued on the Caesar of Chittor in 1569, he sounds like a very orthodox Muslim sovereign celebrating victory over the Kafirs. Then how it was that a turn came in the 1570s? The turn came because in the beginning, he wanted to be known as a Muslim king who gave to the Muslims a unified Sharia. And I think it was this ambition which ultimately opened the doors to reason. Because when the Ibadat Khana was established and the discussions with some theologians began, it soon became clear that Akbar wouldn't get out of the theological Islam what he wanted. He couldn't get a sanction for his numerous wives. Marriage is more than 4. But apart from that, we found that the mullahs were very unreasonable. A Brahman priest was killed. A Brahman was killed, Matra Brahman, despite Akbar's desire, not that he shouldn't be punished because of blasphemy. It is very little known that under Muslim theology as interpreted by Abu Hanifa, non-Muslims cannot be punished for blasphemy. Only Muslims can be punished for blasphemy. This is, of course, forgotten today in Pakistan, but that's another. From here, as is well known, began his dissatisfaction with Muslim theology, which for some reason, I think very good reason, was promoted by Abul Fazl, despite the fact that Shaykh Mubarak, the father of Abul Fazl, was not a rational thinker. He was a theologian, perhaps one who changed his views often, but certainly not a man of reason. But I think very early in the day, Abul Fazl began to have doubts about Muslim theology. And this is particularly marked by Badayuni, who was in close contact with Abul Fazl in 1570s and till very late as well. It is in these times, late 1570s, that the conflict between what one would call maqulat and manqulat came to the forefront. Abul Fazl began to draft Akbar's farmads and letters relating to religious matters. And in 1581, in a letter addressed to Portuguese or European sages, but within the letter, the addressee is the King of Spain or the King of Barsha Farang. But we are not concerned with this character. We are concerned with the major statement in which the letter, Akbar's letter drafted by Abul Fazl, says that it is by aql that we must produce and by tahqiq, research. That is how religion should be tested. And that I don't find adequately in the religions I've studied. So he asked for a second Jesuit mission to be sent. The first had already visited. This is the first time that in documents, aql is now invoked as the test for religion. And this, I think, is a very important break point, which often we have missed in normal essays on Akbar's religious policy. How does reason come in? How does aql come in? And Badayuni might say that other religions were influencing him and so on. And there are many things that Akbar said which we would hardly agree. For instance, the statement that poor people should not be educated. That is inverse. He had that class view. But let us, for the moment, overlook it and go to other statements. What does he have against Islam in his statements? That Islam doesn't provide enough for daughters. The daughter's share should not be half, it should be more than the son's share, because the daughter is helpless. Only the son can earn. This is a very important criticism of Islam, Islamic law, Sharia. Or his condemnation of sati, that husbands don't treat their wives when they are alive, and they want them to burn themselves in order to help their husbands in future life. So there's no turning from Islam towards Hinduism. He has criticisms against both, and a wonderful criticism against both religions, in which he says there are no prophets in India. There have been no prophets in India because if you can become a god or incarnation of God, why would you stop at being a prophet? In other words, he's attacking both the institutions of prophethood and of godhood. He's not attacking God, of course. Now, of course, that reason had limitations. And that reason for it was, for instance, a belief in God was regarded as quite rational. Man produces, so the universe is also produced by the power, superior power. And often Abul Fazl and Akbar regard pantheism as a rational belief. God cannot be seen because God is everything. And there, of course, this would open the doors to, in Jahangir's time, to the study of Vedant. Vedant of Shankaracharya's version. But essentially, Abul Fazl in his Ain-e-Akbari argues that no king should suppress reason, should allow the suppression of reason. A very important statement. He further says that religion should not influence polity. And in a passage which has been ignored largely, thankfully, because of loose translation by Blockman, he in fact argues that in the early history of Islam, the religious leaders should not have governed. It's a criticism of both the Prophet and Caliphal regimes in the pious Caliph. That should not have been there. Says that kings should not suppress reason in order to be popular. Now, these are very important statements from which have been missed, I think, because of Blockman's rapid translation of the passage, sometimes even mistranslation. It is therefore wrong to think that Akbar was trying to build a religion out of a mixture of all religions. There is no such evidence at all. But he was increasingly, and his associates, Abul Fazl and his other associates, Hakim Abul Fateh and so on, were convinced more and more about the importance of reason. And it was there under this influence that ultimately they took a Sufic belief and converted into a secular principle, Sulh-e-Kul, absolute peace. That should be the major principle of relationships between human beings. You will see that Sulh-e-Kul doesn't involve religion at all. Sulh-e-Kul means all people. And that again was actually worked out, as I've tried to show in a recent paper, by those very scholars who were trying to present to Akbar the belief in reason or aql. Now, I come to the period after Akbar, and this is a story of a depressing story, because somehow the fight for reason lost out. I think perhaps it was over ambitious. Perhaps religion had too deep roots in India, and Jahangir made concessions, obvious concessions. In the beginning, he was all for Solekul. Later on, this was lost out. One very great friend of Abul Fazl was in the beginning highly praised and later on dismissed as a heretic, mulhid. Therefore, clearly, in Jahangir's reign, concessions were already made on this. This doesn't mean, of course, that he changed the religious policy. As is well known, the person who he praises most among the religious people is Jadrup or Chitrup, whom he met many times, both at Ujjain and then at Mathura. And it was in relation to a description of Jadrup that he made his famous statement that Tasawwuf is Vedant. Of course, this equation is only valid if you take Sufism, Tasawwuf as interpreted by Ibn al-Arabi, and Vedant as interpreted by Shankaracharya. Pantheistic elements. But certainly it is a very interesting statement. And then in Shah Jahan's time, you have Dara Shikoh, who studies religion but is hostile to reason. And his translation of the Upanishads in 1655 is an outstanding achievement, but it has nothing to do with reason. He's trying to see common points among religions. And that, of course, is important in a country like India. And his translation of Upanishads, despite its conversion of Upanishads into a monotheistic text, is questionable. But nevertheless, he made Upanishads a widely known literature through its Latin translation, by which Upanishadic philosophy, as interpreted by Dara Shikoh, which one would say was half Islamicized, became very popular in Europe in the 18th century. But all this is a departure from the rationalism of Akbar's time. In the famous book Dabistan, written by a Parsi who called himself Mobad, there's an interesting description both of Akbar's views, and it's remarkable that as far as Akbar is concerned, in his picture of the discussions of religion there, reason is not today. Jews come in, Christians come in, and these are, of course, made up discussions, because there was no Jew as far as we knew, in the post-Ibadat Khana discussion that Akbar's called. Christians were there, of course. And in these discussions, there's condemnation of Islam. For instance, disbelief in Prophet's miracle of Shaq al-Qamar, breaking the moon in two parts, openly said. And I think it's amazing that India was sometimes different, because if you study the manuscripts of Dabistan, or Dabistani Mazahib as it is known, it passes through, they have passed through Muslim and Hindu hands. I've seen manuscripts where someone has rewritten these term in Sanskrit terms, Nagari, on the margin. So certainly a scholarly Hindu reader. There are others who have transcribed it, Persian manuscript writers, but they never say anything, even when prophets' miracles are disbelieved in the book, where Islam is attacked in the book, because he says, the author says that I include everything what anyone has said. If Muslims make a statement against other religions, that is also entered. Now there is an interesting piece about reason, about rationalists. And here, I must say that it seems that there was a different India at that time. He's talking about Shah Jahan's reign. He's talking about a rationalist who lives in a sarai at Farah, who's an Iranian. Farah is between Mathura and Agra, closer to Mathura. And this man doesn't believe in prophets. He doesn't believe in Prophet Muhammad. He rejects the whole of Islam. And yet he has friends. Farsantki, the famous Iranian philosopher, is corresponding with him. And when he dies, he says, don't turn my head towards the west, turn it towards the east, so that everyone should know that I was not a practicing Muslim. That such a man should be there, that he should be tolerated, he should have friends. He distributes his inheritance from among poor people. That tells us something about India, say in around 1650. As Badayuni said, India is a country where nobody bothers about what anybody else says. You can get away with anything. This chap bore the name of Hakim Kamran, and when he died, there was a successor also, but about whom the Dabistan doesn't say anything except giving his name. Therefore, although as far as the state was concerned, it had been goodbye to Maqulat, although its interest in different religions remained. Dara Shukro was the favorite son of Shah Jahan, despite Shah Jahan being relatively an orthodox Muslim. But then Aurangzeb's turn comes, and the official policy changed gradually towards Orthodox Islam. But after 1707, that also went. In fact, Muhammad Shah, for all his faults, wanted to copy Akbar. He's represented as playing holy. But a policy of religious tolerance should not be mistaken for a patronage of reason. And Abul Fazl had followers in style, but not in his thought. And the reasons why rationalism gradually disappeared has to be investigated. But it did not entirely disappear. It lived in certain concepts like that of Mubahid. We might think that belief in God cannot be rational, but rationalists did not so believe. Man produces and God produces the universe. And therefore, there was this concept of mubahid, monotheist. Abdul Haq, in his account of um, uh, saints, Muslim Sufis, at the end, in his introduction, writing in Akbar's time, late Akbar's time, says that his grandfather was asked by his father when a child about Kabir, and the answer was Kabir was a mubahid. He was neither a Hindu nor a Muslim. Mubahid means monotheist. And he was asked, what is the difference between Hindus and Muslims on one side and Mubahid on another, monotheist? So he replied that this is too serious a question, you will understand later. Mubahid is a monotheist who only believes in reason and therefore rejects ritual. And I could come now to the Persian poetry in Akbar's time. Urfi represented this particular vision. I cannot recite the verses now because they won't be understood. But in these verses, he rejects Islam. He rejects kufr or non-Islam. He rejects their mixture by which he is attacking Akbar's religious views perceptively. Because none of them could explain why humankind has been created by God. So you will see in poetry, and you know Urfi is regarded by Badayuni as a Dushman-e-Khuda, enemy of God. But nevertheless, he says that he is the most popular poet. His divan is on sale in every nook and corner of India. He's in Akbar's time. And his famous verse that is, so live, Urfi, that when you die, a Muslim bathes your body in holy water and a Hindu cremates it. Very famous verse at one time. And therefore, in Urfi's entire poetry, a denunciation of Muslim theology is exceptionally marked. And there's a touch of Shelley also, where he says that those who have worked hard, there will be a tomorrow when those who have worked hard, they will not be asked to pay anything. But those who have been idle will have to pay a lot. I wish more and more people know Persian so they could enjoy Urfi's Persian verse. And what's astonishing is the popularity of Urfi, despite his anti-religious views throughout his poetry. Well, at the end, I would say that rationalism, medieval rationalism, did not entirely disappear. And when Ram Mohan Roy wrote his first book, and that was in Persian in 1803, this was Tafatul Mubahideen, invoking the concept of Mubahid as we had learned from Abdul Haq. And as we learned later from Ghalib, who says Mubahids reject every religion, every ritual. And that is what Ram Mohan Roy argues, that there could only be one belief in God and all ritual and everything else is invalid. And that is the bugle for what is called the Indian or Bengal Renaissance. And similarly, among Muslims, Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who when he pronounced his doctrine that the word of God must conform to the work of God in around late 1880s, In a sense, he was repeating what Abul Fazl had said in the Ain Akbari, which he in fact was the first person to edit, and Sayyid Ahmad. So I still believe that Mughal period rationalism has still something to offer to the Indian Renaissance of the 19th century. Whether it has something to offer to us now, where every day we are learning to replace history with mythology, I wouldn't know. That's for future to show. Thank you.
Hello, hello Smriti, can I come in?
Yes, sir, of course.
Yeah. Irfan Saab, thank you very much for this mesmerizing lecture. Its depth and its width, both of them are breathtaking. And above all, so
ওনার
correct.
একটা স্পিচ হচ্ছে সেটা পুরো মেট্রোতে শুনলাম, মেট্রোয় ওই 1 ঘন্টা ছিল বলে শুনতে পারলাম, নাহলে তো কানেকশন
who is hello, Dr. Malika Basu, please. Hello, please mute yourself. The function is still going on, it's not ended. Hello. Anyway, hello, can I yes, Smriti, can I come back?
Yes, sir, of course.
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you very much. As I said, both its depth and its width were mesmerizing. But above all, the critical element that is so characteristic of Professor Irfan Habib's thinking, writing, speaking, everything is subject to critical evaluation. Whether it is Akbar or it is Darashuko or it is Maulvis or it is poetry, nothing is taken for granted, and that is the mesmerizing part of the lecture. There would be certainly many questions, many discussions of it, I'm sure. Yeah, there would be, I'm sure, and there would be discussion of it. But I think what the takeaway from the lecture is that history is essentially a critical discipline. You have to ask questions, put questions to everything that you receive from history, every kind of evidence, and not be blind to the darker side of whatever theme that you are exploring. So thank you very much, Professor Irfan Habib, for a wonderful lecture. Let me say that this lecture, the text of this lecture would be published in the next issue of Medieval History Journal, in the May issue of Medieval History Journal. So those who have heard it and have been charmed by it, wonderful. Those who are not able to hear it, of course, it would be available on YouTube, I'm told. But in any case, it would be available in written text in the year May, in next year May issue of 2023. I'm sure there would be questions. My colleague Pratik, I'm sorry, why am I mixing up? My colleague Pratyay would be handling these questions. So those who have questions, they may write these questions out, and Pratyay would sort of take it from there. Pratyay?
Thank you, Professor Mukhia, and thank you, Professor Habib, for this excellent lecture. Thank you so much. We already have some questions in the chat box, and I'm going to read them out one by one and then come to you for your responses. Protiti Bhattacharya has written, can it be argued that Akbar's rationalism was an influence of Sheikh Mubarak and Abul Fazl, and the reason it declined was the absence of guidance?
About Sheikh Mubarak, we didn't know that he was a rationalist because he was a theologian. And according to Abul Fazl, he was deeply influenced by Ibn Arabi, which of course means that reason was not his main field. It's on the other hand Abul Fazl who from around 1581 began to sound the bugle of Aql all the time. And you can see it, the attitude towards the Mahzar, which is often called the infallibility decree of 1579, the declaration of theologians by which Akbar could interpret the Shariat. Sheikh Mubarak said, this is the object of my lifetime. But Abul Fazl in his Akbarnama says that this kind of responsibility for the ruler, for the sovereign, was in fact not proper. Sovereign is much above just being an interpreter. So you can see the difference between father and son. Abul Fazl was not a theologian. Abul Fazl was, I think, a philosopher. And that's the difference between Mubarak and Abul Fazl.
Thank you so much. Next, Harshvardhan is asking, when you talk about reason and rationality in medieval religion, is there a process of boundary making whereby true religion is differentiated from false religion?
You see, first we have to identify the rationalists. That's a very difficult problem. But if you take these two figures, Abul Fazl and Urfi, then they are considering all religions inadequate. There's not, that is, for instance, Abul Fazl describes Hinduism very fairly. In fact, I think he's given a very good certificate by Jadunath Sarkar, who says that this description of religion, Hindu religion, is so complete that it doesn't need any further annotation. But there is no acceptance of Hindu religion. Description is there. And the insistence is, of course, on Sulh Kul there, that everything should be tolerated. Therefore, there is neither acceptance of Hinduism, nor of Islam, nor of any other religion. That you can see, particularly in the sayings of Akbar, which Abul Fazl has collected together, and on Abul Fazl's own remarks throughout. As I've just said in a paragraph, fortunately not literally translated by Blockman, otherwise Muslims have been greatly aroused. Akbar, in fact, Abul Fazl, in fact, criticizes the early political system of Islam.
Thank you so much. Om Tiwari has a question. He asks, what effect did Mehdavi thought have on Abul Fazl and Akbar?
You see, Mehdavi thought had no effect on these two. Right? But Sheikh Mubarak was accused of Mehdavi tendencies. In this debate, it is not clear what part of Mehdavi theology he accepted, because in fact Mehdavi theology and the works are not available now. He himself said that he regarded the Mehdavi prophet as a very pious person. Beyond that, he said he didn't agree with them. So, again, the problem is that as far as Sheikh Mubarak is concerned, we have only indirect evidence from Badayuni and Abul Fazl about his views. And as far as they are concerned, I mean, Badayuni says the views, he was a pupil of Sheikh Mubarak. So he praises his learning, but he says that he changed his views according to the prevailing wind. I am not a judge of this, but I would think that Badayuni must have reason to say this.
Thank you so much. There are a lot of questions. Let's see how much we can cover. Progyan Dash is asking, he's relating Mughal history with the contemporary period and asking, with all this talk about New India and with Mill's interpretation of Indian history still being pursued, with the concept of class being completely absent in this discussion, how does Professor Habib see the Mughal era, history of the Mughal era, in helping reorient the idea of New India?
Well, you see, the fact is that New India can't be built on Mughal foundations. Nobody can visualize that. The other thing is that we should understand Mughal India by understanding the conditions of the time. Mughal India, or for that matter, Delhi Sultanate, were not foreign regimes in the sense that any foreign country governed India. Whatever was collected in India was spent in India. And therefore, this kind of talk which our ministers are indulging in, 1,000 from Prime Minister downwards, 1,000 years of slavery is absurd. If there was slavery, there were thousands of years, because actually there was no democracy in, say, the Mauryan Empire or Gupta Empire. Rulers were not elected. They belonged to higher castes. So the caste system was there. So actually, the best thing for us to do is to look at the UGC syllabus for BA course of history, where the caste system enters history in the medieval times. There was no caste system in ancient times according to this. And yet, origins of the Rajputs becomes very important in this syllabus, as if Rajputs don't form a caste. And Akbar is, of course, ruled out. He's not there in the syllabus. So, Hindu Patpadshahi is put in Aurangzeb's time instead of in Muhammad Shah. So, there's a whole nonsense which is being taught now. The absurdities are so many, like Professor Bipin Chandra being confused with Bipin Chandra Paul, that that gives us an assessment of what our rulers are like today.
Thank you, Professor Habib. Moving on, Shauraditya Banerjee is asking about Deen-e-Ilahi and the role of religion and reason in its formation.
Actually, Deen-e-Ilahi is a word which Abul Fazl uses once, and which Badayuni uses too. And it is from Badayuni that this was picked up by the author of Dabistan. He didn't have access to Ain Akbari or Akbarnama. And this, of course, means divine faith, but it doesn't mean a religion. Abul Fal uses it for just a belief in God and nothing else. If one looks at the chapter which Blockman has, whose heading Blockman has translated as divine faith, actually the heading is Ain Iradat Gozinan, which means the body of disciples, which you can see is totally different from Deen Ilahi, divine faith. So how Blockman could mistranslate like this, I don't know. But this has led to the thought that Akbar founded a religion called Deen Ilahi. He was actually assembling disciples who would carry out his message of Sulh-e-Kul. As far when the Akbarnama, Ain Akbari was written. And before the slogan of Sulh-e-Kul was invented around 1590, these disciples were already being engaged, but they were to promote pantheism and so on. But basically promote good relations among different communities.
Thank you so much. Maybe we have another 5-10 minutes and then we have to wind up. Maybe 2 or 3 more questions. Amna Latif is asking, how do you interpret the idea of sovereignty with this analytical line of reason and unreason?
Well, of course, Abul Fazl and Akbar both thought that sovereignty is very rational. And they had their own theory. In fact, Abul Fazl puts forward a theory of social contract. And so clearly they had in mind some justification on the ground of reason for sovereignty. But Abul Fazl doesn't relate sovereignty to religion. And that's a very important point there. In fact, as I've said before, he says that religion should not be allowed to dominate a state.
Thank you. Arikul Haq is asking about the influence of the European Reformation of the 16th century on ideas of religion and rationality in the Mughal Empire.
Actually, Akbar was not aware of the Reformation. In fact, even the author of Dabistan, in his chapter on Christianity, written in 1655, is not aware of Protestantism. He gives a description of Christianity based entirely on Catholic conceptions. So clearly, the Reformation had no influence. And actually, Reformation was as orthodox or religious and narrow-minded as Catholicism, perhaps in some respects more. So I don't know what kind of, even if they had learnt about Luther, what particular message this would have carried to them. I think the Catholic, the Jesuit father was very right when he said of Akbar that his tolerance of all religions is against the rules of all religions. No religion wishes tolerance. So there was, I think, little to learn from the Reformation or from Catholic Christianity as far as Akbar is concerned. Except, of course, that he was persuaded by the Catholic priests to condemn sati. And that, I think, is a role that we must attribute to Christianity.
Thank you. There's a question from Surjo Jarf, who is asking, in recent history, reformist movements like the Ahle Quran or Quranism and Tolue Islam have questioned or completely rejected the importance of hadith as a source of Islamic law. It is known that similar ideas also prevailed among medieval Arab thinkers. Was there any scholar or thinker in medieval South Asia who argued against the established hadith corpus as a source of the Sharia?
Well, you know, the real view or his realistic view is the opposite. Through hadith, many important ideas get into Islam which are not there in the Quran. So hadith manufacture in the early centuries of Islam is a very important element of Islamic thought. This is too delicate a subject for me to go further into it, but it is quite clear that many ethical statements in hadith enlarge the sweep, religious sweep of the Quran. And if you eliminate hadith, then many very important elements of Islamic jurisprudence, some rational elements, will be wiped out.
Thank you so much. Perhaps the last question of the day, we are out of time now, almost. This is from Professor Nadeem Rezavi. He seeks your explanation for the present regime's ostracization of Akbar, but highlighting the role of Dara Shikoh. And what is the dynamics of rationalism here?
I'm not a psychologist, but clearly Akbar is very hard to explain for the present regime. And Dara Shikoh, for the wrong reasons, for instance, Dara Shikoh's major interests in the beginning were in Sufism, but they are actually promoting his translations of the Upanishads for this reason. But at the same time, they deny that Dara Shikoh promoted Upanishads or that his translation had any. That is very interesting. That when I and my co-author in a People's History volume mentioned that Dara reviews strongly attacked by pro-BJP historians, as if Dara Shikoh did not contribute to the international repute of Upanishads at all.
Okay. We have received a
Dara
couple
Shikoh,
of
they are particularly bringing to light, they are defaming Aurangzeb. Well, I'm all for it. I have no particular interest in protecting Aurangzeb or defaming him, but that seems to be the reason.
Thank you. We have about a couple of minutes left. Would you mind taking one or two more questions, perhaps?
No, I will take.
Okay. Maybe I'll read out a couple of, okay, maybe one by one. So there's two last questions that I would like to take up. One is by Chandini Jaiswal, who's asking what kind of relationship Sufis shared with other scriptures like the Gita or Guru Granth Sahib.
Yes. No, I can't hear.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now.
Okay. So one question from Chandini Jaswal is about the relationship of Sufis with other sorts of scriptures like the Gita and the Guru Granth Sahib, and the role of rationalism in that relationship.
Well, actually, I have not seen any Sufi text influenced by either Kabir or Guru Granth Sahib. But Guru Granth Sahib does contain verses attributed to Sheikh Farid, who was a Sufi. So that relationship is there. Because this is now a religious matter, whether these verses are genuine or not, so that's a different matter. But certainly Sheikh Farid had a reputation, and verses attributed to him form part of the Guru Granth Sahib.
Thank you. And perhaps the last question of the day from Shubhronil Chakraborty, who is asking, how much of Akbar's or Aurangzeb's rationalism or orthodoxy was a response to the political events of their times?
Well, in Akbar's case, political events don't seem to have influenced him, because actually it was his success by early 1570s that made him thought, according to Badayuni, and I think he's quite right on that. Think of the favor that God had assigned him, given him, and he wanted to thank God for that. As for Aurangzeb, it is quite possible that his internal difficulties, which mounted in time, as was argued by my former late colleague Professor Ali, led him to invoke religion more and more, which was not the case early in the reign. But certainly from late 1660s, he became increasingly intolerant. Of course, intolerance had its limits. Rajputs and Marathas formed an increasingly large segment of his nobility. But it goes without saying that he did change the religious policy of the Mughal Empire. On the other hand, his successors, notably after Bahadur Shah, tried to go back to Akbar's policy. Muhammad Shah, poor fellow, wanted to model himself after Akbar.
Thank you, Professor Habib. Okay, I think now we have to really wrap up because we are really out of time now. My sincere apologies to people whose questions we could not take up today. But let me, sincerely thank Professor Habib on behalf of the entire editorial collective of the Medieval History Journal. Let me express my heartfelt gratitude for delivering this 25th Medieval History Journal annual lecture. We are really grateful.
No, thank you very much for your kindness. Thank you.
It is also my duty to offer the vote of thanks now. So we are also thankful towards Professor Harbans Mukhia, the founder editor of our journal, who arranged the lecture and also chaired the session. This lecture was also made possible by the organizational and technical support of Sage Publications. Smriti Sudhakaran, the senior marketing manager of Sage, was crucial in particular in making this lecture possible. She was immensely helpful and thoroughly accessible. We are really grateful for that. Special thanks also to Archana Jha, Deepa Linto, and Neetu Kalra, who lent their support as well. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank the former and current members of the editorial team at Sage, including Gaurav Gupta, Neha Bahuguna, Sangeeta Gupta, Amit Kumar, and Priya Rai. Last but not the least, our heartfelt thanks to all the members of the audience who listened to this lecture today and also participated in this discussion. Thank you all very much, and thank you, Professor Habib, once again.
Thank you.
Very good evening.